Aloha kako. My name's Brianna Govea. I'm the program specialist at the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center. Mahalo nui for joining our program tonight. I want to thank Chief Justice Mark Rechtenwald and the Hawaii State Judiciary and Legislature for their tireless work throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and their continued support of our mission. 2020 has been a year fraught with tragedy and uncertainty. But out of this fear and pain, mass mobilizations of people have come together to fight against racism and injustice across America. At the center, it's our kuleana to reflect on the impact of public policy that has been undermined by hate and inequality in our community. So joining us tonight to speak on some of these issues is Jonathan Okamura, a recently retired professor from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He's also a researcher and has authored many books, including Race to Death in 1920s Hawaii, which was published last year, and Ethnicity and Inequality in Hawaii, which was published in 2008. Before we begin, I encourage our live audience, I see we have about 40 of you with us, to send in questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and John will respond to them at the end of his presentation. A friendly reminder that this program is also being recorded and it'll be posted on our YouTube channel. So mahalo, John, for speaking to us tonight, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Brianna. Thanks to everyone for zooming in for my presentation. I'd like to thank the Judiciary History Center for inviting me to give it, and particularly to Brianna and Kiahi Davis for setting up my PowerPoint presentation to you and my lecture when we had some technical difficulties just before we started. I'll just start now with a brief summary of what I'll be talking about regarding the Fukunaga case, a little background about his very short life and the crime he committed, the kidnapping and killing of Gill Jamieson, which led to his eventual execution. My book and what I'll talk about will include discussion about the many racial injustices in the case that led to Fukunaga's very quick conviction and death sentence. Then I'll turn to the connection between the Fukunaga case and the better known Massie-Kahahawal case that occurred just 3 years later, and how both of these young local men were raced to death. Lastly, I'll take up some more contemporary issues that Brianna alluded to, such as systemic racism that has become a very commonly invoked term in the media. I'm sure most of you have heard it since the killing of George Floyd on May 25th of this year. And then also talk about what's called the Hawai'i Multicultural Model, this view of Hawaii as a setting of very tolerant, harmonious, egalitarian ethnic relations, which has also been invoked locally here to compare what has happened in the protests against police violence compared to the very violent upheavals we've seen on the continent. So let me start now then with a picture of Gill Jamieson that appeared in the Star Bulletin the day after his kidnapping. He was a 10-year-old Punahou student, and he was pictured pretty much as he was at that time. As he went to school, apparently went to school barefoot, as many young kids in Hawaii did at that time. This is the mugshot of Myles Fukunaga. He was 19 at the time of the killing, 5 feet tall, very slight build. There were many references to him just being a boy during the trial because of his very youthful appearance. The background of his life: he was born on Kauai as Yutaka Fukunaga. Myles was the name he took for himself after his family moved to Honolulu in 1924. He was the chonan. In Japanese, it means the oldest son, with 6 younger siblings following him. And as the chonan, he had the greatest responsibility for taking care of his family, besides, of course, his parents. So he had to go to work rather than continue with his education, which he could have done when his family eventually moved to Honolulu. But in December of 1924, the family moved to Waialua, and he finished the 8th grade at Waialua Grade School at the top of his class. He was a very bright student and enjoyed writing according to his teachers. But he was 16 years old at this time, you might notice, several years older than most 8th grade students. After picking pineapple that summer in Wahiawa with his father, the Fukunaga family moved to downtown Honolulu in September of 1925. Now, at the time of the killing, they were living very close to Queens Hospital, where he and his father found work immediately after they moved to Honolulu. But I'm not sure exactly where they were living before. They were living at a rented cottage at the intersection of Britannia and Alapai Street. So you can see it's very close to the Queens Hospital. He could have walked from their home to McKinley High School, or he could have taken the streetcar there. But the poverty of his family meant that he had to go to work, as he did, to help support his parents, support their large family. And so he said in his confession, after he had been captured 4 days after the killing, that not being able to continue with his education was the biggest disappointment of his life, because he knew he was a bright student and he very much enjoyed going to school. So he quit his job, though, at Queens Hospital in March of 1928 after $5 raise, which had been promised to him twice, was not forthcoming. And before he quit, though, he took some medicine from Queens Hospital and tried to kill himself, first by taking the medicines, and when that failed, then he tried to hang himself. As he told the police following his capture, he was very unhappy with his life. He had no friends. He referred to books as his only friends in life. But subsequently, he was captured and convicted, put on trial, and sentenced to death for the killing of Gill Jamieson on September 18, 1928. But legal appeals of that conviction delayed his execution until November of 1929. These appeals were funded by the Japanese American community through donations to a campaign organized by the Hawaii Hochi newspaper, the publisher of which was Fred Makino. So when he was hanged, his body was taken to a Japanese mortuary in downtown Honolulu, and a Buddhist ceremony was initially held for him. Hundreds of people came to pay their last respects to him. This delayed the start of this ceremony. His body was then taken in a hearse in a procession to the Japanese cemetery in Moi'ili up King Street. And he was buried there after another service, after, again, hundreds of people showed up to pay their respects. In 3 of the letters he left to his family and attorney and the Catholic Church, he referred to himself as James. This was his baptismal name after he converted to Catholicism shortly after being sentenced to death. And he was buried that same day of his execution in the Japanese cemetery in Moi'ili, which some of you perhaps have seen if you go down Keolani Avenue towards High School. It's on your right. His gravestone is very easily found because it's about 8.5 feet tall, including his concrete base. It was probably donated by the Japanese American community because his parents could not afford an impressive gravestone. Gravestones are in the cemetery made of polished marble or granite, as you see. This is a photo of a very large gathering held 5 days after Fukunaga's execution at the Chogakuen language, Japanese language school at the intersection of Vineyard Street. It was organized by the Hawaii Hochi newspaper to give their last accounting of Fukunaga's execution. 1,000 people showed up for this Sunday evening gathering, I interpret this very large audience as a protest on the part of the Japanese community to the conviction and execution of Fukunaga. The Japanese American community had been organizing these meetings shortly after the conviction and death sentence given to Fukunaga, and they would attract capacity audiences to Japanese movie theaters where they were held. But I'm almost certain that the organizers from the Hawaii Ho-Chi knew that thousands of people would show up if they held this last meeting for them to hear about the Fukunaga case. And this was why it was held outdoors on a Sunday night. So let me give the background of the kidnapping and killing of Gill Jamieson, 10-year-old Punahou student, the only child of his parents who lived in Manoa. His father was, Frederick, was a vice president of the Hawaiian Trust Company. His father had two other brothers from Scotland, where they came from in Hawaii. His father came in 1910 to work for, I think, the Bishop Bank. And then subsequently, his mother came from California as a school teacher 2 years later. They were living on Kahawai Street, the same street where Thalia Massie and her husband Tommy were living 3 years later. They may have been living there in 1928 also. The house is still there on Kahawai Street on the right side as you go down. Now, Fukunaga, as I said, had quit his job with the Queen's Hospital. So he was at home in May of 1928 when a rent collector from the Hawaiian Trust Company came to collect $20 in overdue rent from the family. And he spoke initially with Fukunaga's mother, who could not speak English very well. This encounter left her in tears. So Fukunaga went outside to speak with the rent collector, and in his confession following his arrest, he told the police that he explained to them, we don't have any money, how can we possibly pay? And that he thought this was very unfair, that a big company like Hawaiian Trust could not wait for a mere $20 sum. So he said he developed a hatred for the Hawaiian Trust Company, which eventually developed into this desire for revenge. And this is how Gill Jamieson became his victim after he found out that Frederick Jamieson was the vice president of the company. So he planned, as he said, during the summer, when after he got a job working in Waikiki at the Seaside Hotel, how he would kidnap a relative, a close relative of an executive at Hawaiian Trust. So he called Punahou School and said he was from the Queen's Hospital, and Gill's mother had been in a traffic accident and wanted to see him, and so they would be sending someone to pick Gill up and to take him to see his mother at Queen's Hospital. And this is how he was able to get Gill from Punahou School in a rented taxi. And he told the driver to take him to Waikiki, to the grounds of the Hilton Hawaiian Village. This is where he got off. This to me is an indication that he knew what he was doing was a crime. It was to throw the police off, where he would eventually kill Gill. So he then took Gill across Kalakaua Avenue to the rear of the Seaside Hotel, which is now the site of the International Marketplace. And then further towards the Alawai Canal under some kiawe trees where he liked to spend his free time reading. And this is where he killed Gill about 11 o'clock that morning, striking him on the head with 5 blows from a metal chisel. So he would be arrested 4 days later, and in his confession, willingly, he mentioned 3 motives. One was to send his parents back to Japan. They spoke regularly about this desire, but they were so poor, this was out of the question. So he thought if he obtained some ransom money, he could use that to help his parents go back to Japan. He also mentioned his desire to die, having failed in his suicide attempts, having his very unhappy life with very limited prospects for advancement subsequently. And he alluded to this desire for revenge. It wasn't as explicit as the other motives, but he did talk about having a little desire to get vengeance against the Hawaiian Trust Company. Now, in committing his crime, Fukunaga was copying these very well-known murder cases that had occurred earlier, the 1924 Leopold and Loeb murder case in Chicago, for example. They were two very brilliant and very wealthy University of Chicago students who thought the kidnapping and killing of a very rich young boy, 14-year-old Bobby Franks. And Fukunaga copied their killing, including the ransom note he wrote, the $10,000 he had asked for in the ransom payment, and also the metal chisel that he used to kill Gill. Fukunaga was also copying another more recent murder case, the Hickman case in Los Angeles, in which Edward Hickman was able to kidnap a 12-year-old girl by calling her father's bank and saying he had been injured in a traffic accident and wanted to see her, and therefore he was able to kidnap her from her school, or was able to get her from her school. And this is, of course, the same strategy that Fukunaga had used to kidnap Gill Jamieson.
I'm so sorry to cut you off, John. We're having just a little bit of issues with sound. Is it possible to speak a little closer to your microphone?
Closer? Okay, okay.
So sorry, thank you.
No. Fukunaga sent a ransom note to Frederick Jamieson that Tuesday afternoon, same day as the kidnapping, and arranged to meet with Frederick Jamieson on Beretania Street across from the Academy of Arts. And he collected $4,000 in ransom payment. Frederick Jamieson refused to give any more money until Fukunaga turned over his son, and then two other men came by, and Frederick Jamieson called for help. Fukunaga was scared and fled the scene and spent $5 from the ransom money to get a taxi back to his tenement house in downtown Honolulu where he was staying. And this would lead to his subsequent arrest because the serial numbers on the $5 bills were printed in the Star Bulletin on Friday of that week. This is an example of one of the newspaper headlines. This is the Sunday Advertiser, the day after the killing. And the Star Bulletin actually came out with an extra edition the same evening as Fukunaga's capture that Saturday, late Saturday afternoon. And these newspaper articles essentially sealed his fate. The newspapers referred to them as the slayer, the murderer of Gill Jamieson, who had confessed to that killing of the young boy. And almost all of the jurors who served on his jury at his trial admitted that they had read these headlines. It would have been hard to miss. In the first 2 weeks following the crime, there were perhaps 8 to 10 articles about it daily in the newspapers, about the crime itself, Fukunaga's background, interviews with his parents, his teachers, former supervisors at work, giving background about his life. There's this article here that you can see about a community fund. The Honolulu Chamber of Commerce on Wednesday, the day after the killing, sponsored a campaign to raise $20,000 that would be given for information leading to the conviction and, well, the arrest and conviction of the kidnappers, as they assumed them to be, of Gill Jamieson. As you can see, the sum was very quickly exceeded. That's an indication of the great interest in the community and also their sympathy for the Jamieson parents. So let me turn to a discussion about the racial injustices in the case. Fred Makino was the publisher of the Hawaii Hochi Japanese newspaper at this time. In his editorials and his speeches about the case, he regularly referred to there being two kinds of justice in Hawaii, one for the dominant haoles and another for non-haoles. Fukunaga's killing was not committed in a racial vacuum. It was committed during the height of the anti-Japanese movement in Hawaii. This began in the first decade of the 1900s, when Japanese were the largest group in Hawaii, by far, about 40% of the population as a result of labor migration. And also in this first decade, Japanese Americans had decided that they would remain permanently in Hawaii as opposed to returning to Japan, as most of them did prior to 1900. So the movement sought to subordinate Japanese because they were viewed as a political, economic, and cultural threat to continued haole supremacy in Hawaii. Japanese Americans were viewed as a political threat because they were suspected of disloyalty to the United States, of maintaining loyalty to Japan. And in the case of an invasion by Japan, the assumption was Japanese in Hawaii would support the Japanese military. The haole population was also very concerned with the growing population of second generation Japanese, like Fukunaga, who were US citizens and who would be able to vote once they became of age and would then be able to vote haoles out of office. Haoles were also concerned about the large strikes on the plantations organized by Japanese Americans, including in 1909, the first multi-plantation strike, and again in 1920, which cost the planters $12 million in losses. So for these various reasons, the haole community wanted to keep Japanese in their place in a subordinate status. And so for them, Fukunaga was not just an individual who had committed a heinous murder. He was a Japanese person who had violated the dominant racial boundary between haoles and Japanese Americans, a group seen as posing the greatest threat to their continued domination in Hawaii. And so because of that violation, the haole community wanted immediate revenge against Fukunaga by his quick conviction and execution. So my book is titled Race to Death, and I have two different meanings in the notion of race. One is that, as I said, Fukunaga was not tried and convicted as an individual without regard to race. He was very much racialized as Japanese, and therefore the jury came back with a very quick conviction and death sentence. He was also raced or rushed to his death sentence. From the time of his arrest, he was then put on trial, sentenced to death. This took little more than 2 weeks. His execution was scheduled for October 23rd because 14 days, according to Hawaii law, had to pass before someone who had been convicted of first-degree murder could be hanged. And during that 14-day period, new attorneys for Fukunaga were hired and filed appeals that delayed his execution as they proceeded to the courts, ultimately to the US Supreme Court. And so he was in hanging here. Now, other examples, and these are some of the more egregious examples of racial injustice in the Fukunaga case. One is that he was probably mentally insane, but he was given just a 90-minute psychiatric exam by 3 court-appointed psychiatrists. The Hawaii law provided for a 10-day exam or an examination over a 10-day period. And this was the practice also, as evident from other cases during the same period when suspects in murder cases was believed to be mentally insane. Now, regarding this issue of his insanity, following the case was a Navy psychiatrist, Dr. Joseph Thompson, based at Pearl Harbor. And a representative of the Hawaii Hochi contacted Thompson and asked him if he had an opinion about Fukunaga's sanity. And Thompson said, well, I've been reading the trial testimony as it appeared in the newspapers every day. I've read his confession, and I believe he suffers from paranoia and psychosis. And so he was asked if he would submit an affidavit detailing his psychiatric analysis, evaluation of Fukunaga, which he did, and that was used in the first appeal to get Fukunaga a new trial. But the judge pointed out that Thompson, while he stated Fukunaga was mentally insane, did not say he was legally insane. And the judge pointed out legal insanity means that one cannot differentiate between right and wrong in their behavior, and therefore he denied that first appeal of Fukunaga's conviction. This issue will come up subsequently in another example of evaluating Fukunaga's insanity. But first, other examples of racial injustice. The jury was heavily biased against him. All of them had read the newspaper accounts of the case as they appeared in the advertising in the Star Bulletin, in which Fukunaga confessed to his crime. Most of them, when they were asked, said they had formed an opinion about Fukunaga's guilt or innocence. And that had to be that he was guilty because he had confessed to his crime, even though, of course, Fukunaga was owed the presumption of innocence. Now, there was one Japanese-American juror. This was Shinji Maruyama, who was a Nisei graduate of McKinley High School. And for 8 years had been the English language editor of the Nichijiji newspaper, the rival of the Hawaii Hochi. One would think, well, this is all Fukunaga needs for a hung jury. One person who would not vote to convict him as guilty. But Maruyama was working for this newspaper, the publisher of which was Yasukawa Soga. Soga and Makino had been close allies in the Japanese strike of 1909 as leaders of the Japanese labor union at that time. But subsequently, they became very bitter enemies. They traded very harsh remarks against one another in editorials regarding not just the Fukunaga case, but earlier in the controversy concerning the closure or attempted closure of Japanese language schools. So Maruyama knew very well what his employer Soga wanted him to do in voting for Fukunaga's conviction, which he did so. Other examples. Fukunaga's court-appointed attorneys presented a 19-minute defense. They called no witnesses. They could have called his parents, his uncle, his former school teachers, his former supervisors of work, all of whom had been interviewed by the newspapers and said they could not believe that the Myles Fukunaga they knew had committed such a violent crime because it was totally inconsistent with his very mild-mannered behavior, his very meek personality, and therefore this was something that needed to be explained. How could someone who had never been in trouble with the law before commit such a brutal murder? The judge, in his instructions to the jury, told them that being legally sane, according to the Hawaii Insanity Act of 1925, just 3 years previously, means that one cannot distinguish between right and wrong. This is the same criterion used at present probably in just about every state in America, but it's only partially correct. There are other factors that are involved in determining legal insanity in Hawaii. So a UH professor named Lockwood Myrick was also following the Fukunaga case. Myrick came to Hawaii several years earlier to teach philosophy with 2 degrees from Harvard. He followed the case, read the confession of Fukunaga, did some interviews with those involved, including Fukunaga's attorneys, his former co-workers, his parents, and he completed what he called an open letter to Governor Wallace Farrington regarding Fukunaga's insanity 3 weeks, though, after the end of the trial, because it's not a letter, it's a very lengthy study, academic study with references, appendices, 40 pages long, in printed text. And his conclusion was that Fukunaga was not just mentally insane, but he was also legally insane according to another criterion in the Hawaii Insanity Act. And that was, if one cannot withstand a force that compels them to commit a crime, then one can be considered legally insane. That force, according to Myrick, was Fukunaga's desire for revenge. And that was his primary motivation for killing Gill Jamieson, because of that contentious encounter with the rent collector from the Hawaiian Trust Company. Now, as I mentioned before, the Fukunaga case is very often compared to the better known Massie-Kahahawal case, which occurred 3 years later. In this case, Joe Kahawai, a native Hawaiian, and 4 local friends of his, another Hawaiian, a Chinese Hawaiian, 2 Japanese Americans, Nisei like Fukunaga, were falsely accused of the kidnapping and rape of Feagin Massie, a 20-year-old wife of a Navy lieutenant in the Ala Moana area in September of 1931. But they were innocent, according to witnesses who took the stand in the defense. They could not have committed the crime at the time she claimed that she was raped, and therefore a hung jury was declared in late 1931 when they were put on trial. I argue in my book, in the chapter comparing the 2 cases, that Kahawai was also raced to death. First, in terms of his race, he was racialized as African American or Black by his 4 killers, particularly Grace Fortescue, Taylor Massey's mother. In an interview with the New York Times, she said, "Well, I'm from the South, and we know how to treat N-word people." And she didn't use the term Black. She used the N-word. And this is another term also used by the person who shot Kahawai to death in Grace Fortescue's rented cottage in Manoa. I also argue that Kahawai was rushed to his lynching by his 4 killers because they could not wait for the retrial of Kahawai and his 4 friends on the rape charge, which would have taken place in 1932. So in the injustices evident in this case, the grand jury initially declined to return any indictment for first-degree murder or any other crime, but the judge urged them to reconvene and deliberate further, and so they returned an indictment for manslaughter, which means that there was no intent on their part to kill Kahawai, but there clearly was evidence of premeditation and intent in his killing. They were in fact convicted and sentenced to 10 years at hard labor at Oahu prison. But immediately after their sentencing, they crossed King Street in the same building where the Judiciary Center is, went to Iolani Palace, which was the seat of government, and had their commutation papers signed by Governor Lawrence Judd, because the previous evening an agreement had been struck between Judd, the 4 convicted killers of Kahawai, the judge, the prosecuting attorney, that Judd would commute their sentence to just 1 hour in custody, and they spent that 1 hour signing those papers for their commutation and posing for pictures on the balcony of Iolani Palace, which survived to this day. So the Kahawai case is much better known because of a much more severe injustice that's clearly evident, and because it demonstrates how Hollis could literally get away with murder at this time. And in my book, I argue the case demonstrates this trajectory of racial injustice against non-Hollis. It's very much connected to the Fukunaga case 3 years earlier, and also, I would argue, to other instances of racial injustice against Filipino and Japanese labor leaders early in the 1920s. A number of Japanese labor leaders who had led the 1920 strike were convicted on conspiracy charges based on perjured testimony, sentenced to several years imprisonment at a royal prison, and eventually released. None of them engaged in any labor organizing activity, which was the reason why they were convicted and sent to prison. Subsequently, the Filipino labor leader in the 1920 and 1924 strikes, Pablo Manlapit, would be convicted, again on perjured testimony, paid for by the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association, sentenced to a prison. Eventually, he would be arrested again several years later, told, well, you can either go back to prison or you can go back to the Philippines. And he chose to return to the Philippines, but this was another way to remove a labor leader from organizing strikes or labor unions against the planters. Now, moving to more contemporary issues, I'd like to bring up this concept of systemic racism, which I'm sure most of you have heard since the killing of George Floyd. I hear it almost every day. No one defines the term. No one acknowledges that a race scholar named Joe Feagin at Texas A&M University was the one who developed what he calls a theory of systemic racism in the early 2000s. And what you can equate systemic racism is a hierarchy of racial oppression, and particularly by whites. Feagin likes to focus on whites as the group most responsible for the maintenance of racial, systemic racism in Hawaii. In doing so, he does this to criticize other race scholars who he says do not focus on the role, responsibility of whites for the perpetuation of racial, systemic racism rather. So briefly again, as a system, systemic racism consists of these four major dimensions: discriminatory practices, not face-to-face individual acts of discrimination though, institutionalized practices, policies, collective policies that result in unfair and unequal treatment, which is what we mean by discrimination. The other dimension I would emphasize, C, maintenance of material and other inequalities, racial inequalities in terms of access to higher education, to employment, to wealth and income, and also, of course, to justice in our criminal justice system. D, racial, I would call them racist stereotypes and representation. This is perhaps the component dimension of systemic racism most closely related to people's understandings of racism. But these are certainly, all of these dimensions that were present historically in Hawaii in the past, and this was a system maintained historically primarily by haoles as the group with the greatest political and economic power. This is not the case at present, though. Haoles have been joined by Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans as the politically and dominant, economically dominant groups. The latter two groups are also very much responsible for the maintenance of systemic racism against minority groups like such as Micronesians, Hawaiians, Samoans, and others. In the case of Micronesians, I would especially emphasize the component of racist stereotypes as one of the most extreme examples of systemic racism. We've all heard these terms, racist stereotypes directed against them as leeches, as cockroaches. What we see here is the denial of a common humanity given to Micronesians. We don't necessarily see these kinds of extreme forms of racism toward other groups in Hawaii. For Native Hawaiians and Filipinos, certainly inequalities are very much part of the systemic racism they are subject to, including their underrepresentation at UH Manoa. Even though together both groups are almost half of the public school students, but I would argue they are subject to institutional discrimination because of the underfunding of the public schools. And the denial of even an adequate education will increase even more so once the public schools open in a couple of weeks. And their denial of an adequate education is evident in the underrepresentation of these two groups at UH Manoa. They certainly are not almost half of the undergraduates at the Manoa campus, which also suffers from underfunding. So, contemporary issues. As I said, probably everyone or most have heard about the view of Hawaii as a setting of very tolerant, harmonious, egalitarian ethnic relations. This is referred to by journalists and some academics as the Hawai'i Multicultural Model, that Hawaii represents a model for other ethnically and racially divided societies in addressing their problems and conflicts related to race and ethnicity. This model, or this idea rather, goes back to the 1920s, when Hawaii was first represented as a racial melting pot by a sociologist named Romanzo Adams, who came to Hawaii 100 years ago to start the sociology department. And he focused especially on the high intermarriage rate in Hawaii at that time, which has of course increased since then. And he thought this was very distinctive about Hawaii's race relations. This idea also emerged though in the Fukunaga case in terms of what I call emergent multiculturalism. The newspapers, the Star Bulletin and Advertiser, talked about Hawaii as a racial paradise, and that the Japanese American community was disrupting the racial harmony in Hawaii when they filed these appeals of Fukunaga's conviction, claiming that he had been discriminated against because he was Japanese. Most recently, of course, some of you may have heard about a New York Times article that was titled "Want to be Less Racist? Move to Hawaii." It was based on a study conducted by University of Hawaii psychologists who interviewed white students from the continent who came to study at our university after several years being here. And they said, well, they thought that had become less racist as a result of living in Hawaii. Well, that operates with a very limited understanding of racism as though it exists in people's minds, and therefore it can be very easily eliminated as opposed to its systemic, institutionalized, structural nature. The model has these 4 dimensions, and the model is very much believed in by the great majority of people in Hawaii. It was also invoked in the weeks following the killing of George Floyd, when protests and demonstrations were taking place across the continental United States and in Hawaii, and people talked about, well, ethnic relations are so much better here. When we have these marches and demonstrations, they don't end up in the kind of violence that's ongoing on the continent. But the model includes these dimensions of a tradition of tolerance among people here, popularized as the lowest spirit that people have for each other. Another dimension is the belief in harmony among different groups here. And the high intermarriage rate in Hawaii is taken as evidence of the supposed harmony. We also have egalitarian ethnic relations. People enjoy equal opportunity and status in their pursuit of employment and education. And what underlies these very positive ethnic relations in Hawaii, it is claimed, is a shared local culture and identity among Hawaii's people, ignoring that many groups are not viewed as local, including immigrants, tourists, military, newcomers from the continent. So the problem with the model is that it obscures how we don't get along with each other. It obscures particularly, I would argue, persisting ethnic inequality in Hawaii. We don't see that as a problem. We don't see the underfunding of our public schools as a problem, which, as I said, to me is an example of institutional discrimination, systemic racism, one could call it, but it denies equal access to employment and education to the great majority, 70% of public school students who are from ethnic minority groups. And so now what the model does is contribute to maintaining things as they are in Hawaii. There is a great gap between the dominant groups, whites, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans in Hawaii, and the subordinate groups, Filipinos, Hawaiians, Samoans, Micronesians, other smaller minorities, that has existed, especially since the 1970s, once tourism became the dominant industry. And that gap, I would argue, is not being closed. And the problems with our dependence on tourism as the mainstay of the economy are very clearly indicated with the very high unemployment we have as a result of the shutdown of the tourist industry. So let me end here. Thank you all for attending my presentation, and please for your questions.
Thank you so much, John. I just want to give a shout out. I have your book here. Oh shucks, my screen isn't showing it. Your Ethnicity and Inequality book, and I really strongly encourage anyone who's interested in learning about more of the research that John has done, please get it. It's so fascinating, and it covers a lot of just the reality of the overall, just our Hawaii is not as the paradise we make it out to be. We have so many issues here. But on a lighter note, going back to some issues about the Fukunaga case, we have a question asking, how do you translate the inscription on his headstone? Do you know what it reads?
Oh, well, I have several Japanese friends of mine who are fluent in both English and Japanese. They teach in Japan, they studied in the US. And it's not a literal translation, but one person told me was, this is the gravesite of someone who committed a misdeed, which was the killing of Gill Jamieson. As I said, it's not a literal translation, but that could be the interpretation of the inscription on the gravestone.
Thank you. And when did capital punishment end in Hawaii? And obviously there must have been great disparity in the racial makeup of who was sentenced to death.
Only one white person was hanged while we had capital punishment. It ended in 1957.
Okay.
After the Democrats took control of the legislature, quickly, well, in 1954, the elections that year, they quickly introduced bills to end capital punishment, and they were successful in having a Republican government. And Walter King signed the bill in 1957. We were still a territory at that time. The 42 persons who were executed in Hawaii, 30 were Filipino, 24. Only one haole, as I said, and only one Hawaiian. One argument has been made that haules intervene in cases of Hawaiians either being tried for first-degree murder or convicted of first-degree murder to prevent their hanging. Actually, I've done a study of capital punishment in Hawaii. I looked at numerous cases from the archives and the university to find out how these different cases ended and why only one Hawaiian. But this is an argument made by another University of Hawaii sociologist, Bernard Horman, that haules would intervene in order to get continued Hawaiian support, because at this time Hawaiians supported Republican candidates for office. And in return, haoles would intervene to prevent any Hawaiians from being executed.
Wow. And on the topic of the jury, so you mentioned that there was one Japanese individual on the jury, and so were the rest haole? And what typically were juries majoritarily haole in the judicial system?
Well, the other jurors were 6 haoles and 5 papa haoles of Hawaiian and Hawaiian ancestry. During this time, haoles were a majority juries. The second largest group would have been Hawaiians. The largest group in Hawaii, but they were too young. Like people like Fukunaga at this time wanted to be 21 years old, and of course had to be male in order to serve on a jury. And therefore, very few jurors were actually Japanese American. There were some Chinese Americans who had come earlier who were of age in order to serve on a jury, having been born in Hawaii. But in the jury selection also brings out the racial injustices in the trial. Now, what's interesting is how Fukunaga, the prosecution attorneys wanted to have Chinese and Hawaiians serve on the jury. The attorneys for Fukunaga objected, arguing that, well, they could not speak English very well. And jurors during the voir dire examination, jury selection, themselves said, I don't understand English very well. I just had a 5th grade education. I don't really want to serve on the jury. But the prosecution and the judge initially wanted them to serve. I think what they wanted to have are these Hawaiian or Chinese American working class jurors who the haoles could dominate in the jury deliberations and have them agree that Fukunaga was guilty. So Fukunaga's attorneys would have to have them try to define numerous legal terms to demonstrate that they did not really understand English before the judge finally agreed to have them excused from the jury.
Thank you, John. Another question. Did the Japanese newspapers take any position about Fukunaga's speedy trial? So was there any outcry about how quickly the 2-week?
Oh, yeah. That's the issue of injustice, or 2 kinds of injustice.
Yeah.
The case that Makino made. Now, as I said, there are 2 major newspapers at this time. Nippujiji was the rival newspaper. The Japanese American community was not a monolith, as many haoles assume. The Nippujiji called for his execution, said that he had a fair trial, and he was given a full psychiatric examination.
Okay, couple quick questions. We only have 5 minutes. Was it the jury who decided the death penalty or the judge?
It was mandatory for a first-degree murder conviction.
Oh, wow. Okay. And then, okay, so what would you suggest steps that the judiciary might take today to acknowledge and address systemic racism?
Well, I didn't mention an example of systemic racism in the criminal justice system against Native Hawaiians. Men, 40% of those who are incarcerated, either in Hawaii or in Oklahoma or Arizona, are Native Hawaiians. Among women who are incarcerated, a majority are Native Hawaiian. So there's systemic racism, not just in sentencing, it could be in the entire criminal justice system in terms of arrests, jury trials, probation, parole, sentencing, imprisonment, etc. I would point to that as another example of systemic racism that Hawaiians in particular face.
Okay, we have, let's see. I guess so in at the end of your ethnicity and inequality book, you speak about how the systems here, public policy, tourism, the school systems, and you mentioned this in your presentation, how they maintain the system of inequality here locally. And so I guess what are your thoughts on how to overcome that? And even if we think about like how you mentioned Japanese Americans used to be a very marginalized group, but now they are kind of at the top dominating with haole. So how do we kind of find resolution in all of that?
Well, because I'm an educator, I would advocate providing equal access to public education at both the K to 12 and the level. The pandemic and the shutdown of the tourist industry will have serious consequences for equal educational opportunity in Hawaii, because the public schools and university are funded by the state.
Can you speak a little closer to your mic? I'm sorry, you're cutting out a little bit.
Sorry. The public schools and the university are funded by the state through tax revenues. Tourism is the major source of those tax revenues. When the industry was booming with these billion-dollar surpluses, the legislature still would not appropriate sufficient funds for the schools. Every August, when the schools used to open, there would be a shortage, still yet, of 1,000 teachers. This will be even worse when they open in a few weeks, because more teachers will retire. They'll have greater difficulty hiring teachers from the continent to come to Hawaii. The problem is the legislature does not view public education as a policy priority. They rather spend money, allocate funds to other kinds of problems that they see as more critical. So this just enhances that issue of ethnic inequality and persistence. At the university, the underfunding has resulted in the university having to raise tuition to the point where local students from Hawaii stopped enrolling, at least at Manoa, giving us 6 consecutive years of enrollment among undergraduates until the university finally had to maintain the same tuition levels for 3 consecutive years. This lower numbers of students may also appear at Manoa this fall, although those students may go to the community colleges.
Yeah. Let's wrap up with one final question. It kind of relates about the themes you were saying, just about just not wanting to allocate the funding and the energy into tackling these issues. But what do you think is the reluctance of addressing the injustice and racism towards Native Hawaiians and Micronesians and Tongans and non-haole ethnic groups in Hawaii? Because, for instance, our attendee Gloria says there was a lot of coverage on Black Lives Matter protests that happened here in Waikiki, for instance, and we get a lot of media attention with the TMT on Mauna Kea. And why, though, when it comes to injustices towards the people of Hawaii, where's the attention? Why is it not being served for them?
In terms by the media, or in terms of our villages?
Media, community, politics.
Well, in terms of politics, this is a very positive outcome from our primary election. 51% of those who registered did vote. One of the reasons I believe that our legislators were reluctant or did not feel that they had to do anything about funding the public schools to provide equal educational opportunity is because they know they can get away with it, because people don't vote. They know they can stay in office. I hope this will change, though, as a result. I hope we get a much higher percentage in the general election.
Yeah.
A high percentage of voters who expressed their discontent in many ways by ousting several incumbents from office. But if you think about the 180,000 public school students, parents who are citizens and voters, that's a huge constituency, several thousand voters that the legislators believe that they can ignore because of the low voting rate, and therefore they do not address that problem of the inadequate education provided to public school kids.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, John, and I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Everyone get out to vote this November. Definitely.
Well, thank you very much, Brianna and Keahi, and also for the attendees for listening to my presentation today.
All right, you take care, John, and mahalo everyone for attending. And we have another program coming up next Tuesday. You should have received an announcement about that, so we hope to see you all then. But with that, thank you so much, and everyone stay safe and have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.